Minerva, and as a part of today's catch-up we are going to be talking pattern match. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term pattern match, as you may be new to sewing, pattern matching is a term that we use when we are trying to match a pattern fabric along a seam line to get that really beautiful continual flow of the pattern within the garment that we have decided to make. Now, to give you a little bit of a visual interpretation of what I actually mean by that, I have dug out my cincher dress that I made earlier in the year from the Charm line of patterns that we stock. And if you're not familiar with the cincher dress, as it's a really great example to use, and an easy one to take on to practice your pattern matching skills, the cincher dress actually has a centre front seam all the way down the front there, and as you can see on my dress here, you can't actually tell where that seam is because we have this great continual flow of the pattern all over the fabric, and you can't tell whatsoever when you look at it that it is actually two pieces of fabric joined down the centre front seam. And just so you know, I'm not fibbing. Here is my seam down the centre front of my cincher dress. So as you can see, it's definitely got a seam to it, but you can't tell, and that is what today's catch-up is all about. So as a part of today's catch-up with the pattern match theme, it's kind of an amalgamation of many things, today's catch-up. So I've got some really great fabrics that we're going to have a look at for you that I've pulled from the website to get your creative juices flowing with using pattern and making up some really statement garments. And I'm also going to do a sew along with the Charm pattern, so the cincher dress, which is a really nice simple pattern for you to practice your pattern matching skills out of one of the fabrics that I have pulled here from the website. And I am going to say straight up, I have pulled something particularly leery, particularly loud, and a few of you may have heart palpitations and nearly burst a blood vessel as you look at my choice. But it's a really good one for you to have a look at and see what I mean by pattern matching. Just really quickly, before we get much further into our catch-up about the pattern match theme that we've got going on today, I thought I would just share with you what I've actually got on, as I do try and wear different makes that I have made as a part of my catch-ups and my showcases, because I think it's really important that I do wear something that I've made when I am talking always about sewing. So it is nice to see that I do sew and do wear what I've made. And what I've got on today is a sweater knit fabric which has got a really gorgeous gold lurex thread through it, and I have made it up in the Hepburn top from the Charm line of patterns. So it's got that really lovely boat neck style with the V at the back, and I've taken it with the long sleeve because for me I wanted something nice and easy to throw on, a little bit more winter themed. And I will say, even though it's got the gold sparkle going on, it has become a very firm favourite. It's super easy to wear when I'm out walking the dog of a morning, obviously not too chilly, but yeah, nice and easy to put on first thing when I need to nip out and do that, go to the shops. And also it is really perfect dressed up if you do want to go out for dinner, especially in this fabric because it's got that little bit of a sparkle to it. So it's got a little bit going on, but it's not too much. So check out my profile, Maree, a mad seamstress, and you will be able to read my write-up about making the Hepburn top. Just a reminder, everything that I do mention today, we will have the little product pop-ups as we go, so you can add them directly into your basket, and then also everything will be tagged at the very end if you would prefer to add it in after you have watched everything in the pattern match video. Also, don't forget to sign into your Minerva account if you need to rewatch anything or pop back at a later stage, especially if you need to head off to work or to take the kids to school. You know, one of those really boring tasks that does interfere with all of our sewing time. And if you haven't got yourself a Minerva account, now is a really good time to log in with your name and your email address before we get started. And by registering with us at Minerva for just your own personal Minerva account, it does allow you to save your favourite fabrics, your favourite patterns, videos like this one, so you can actually pop back and watch it really easy, because you know exactly where you have saved it to, and you don't have to go through the website to look for the pattern match video, because you've just saved it directly into your own personal reference part of your Minerva account. And also, when you do join us here at the Minerva community, we do send a really lovely thank you to your inbox, so watch out for that if you've just signed up. When we talk about pattern can mean quite a lot of different things, but yes, it is going to be a fabric with a pattern on it in some way, shape or form. So it can be something that is going to be a stripe or a check, or something that is a really small scale print that is referred to as a ditzy print, or you've got something else that is referred to as like a pattern on self, which would be something like, say, a white floral tiny motif design, or even a paisley design is really popular on a white background. So there will be a slight shade variation, but you will be able to see the pattern on top of the fabric. So that is always like a plain on a plain, which creates a lot of interest. And I have shown different variations of that through other catch-ups that I've done. And then the other thing is that I guess you then move on to different scales of patterns. So you can have something that's quite a small design, or something that is quite a big design. And that is all encompassing in pattern, and it's how you work with those patterns, or those different shape patterns within your garments, to get a really nice finish and flow. When we're talking pattern matching, what do we really mean by pattern matching? Well, we mean by getting that really lovely flow through of your pattern all the way across where you've got a seam, so you don't actually see the seam. So that's the most obvious definition of pattern matching, where you don't want to see that seam and you want to get that perfect flow through. But there's obviously a few little tricks that you do need to know on how to achieve that. So first off, you've got to make sure that you take your time and cut your fabric out, and we will have a look at that a little bit further in depth later on in the video. And also I will share with you my painstakingly fairly slow technique on how I stitch together a particularly long seam like this one to get that really nice even result. So you can't tell obviously where that seam is, because you don't notice any obvious disjointedness through the actual seam with that pattern flow. Now I just want to say, this blue flower here, that was the starting point of where I decided that I wanted my pattern on my dress to begin at. It's quite a mouthful, that, isn't it? Because when I was considering all the design lines within the dress, and also within what the fabric looked like, and I must say it's a lot easier sometimes to buy fabric, add in a bit extra. I always roughly add in somewhere between 1/3 and 25%, because depending upon the cost of the fabric, I always try and add in that at least 1/3, because it gives me enough to play with to get a really nice placement of my garment pattern on my fabric. And as you will see here, with this particular one here, at the end of that opening, I have got the top of my blue flower. So I've really thought about where I place that blue flower in relation to where the rest of the pattern falls, because it's slightly off center. And if we look at, because this one here is a little bit easier to look at, if we look at this one here, again, even though this one's off center, that one's slightly off center, and you probably find that that center front seam line is somewhere in between the two, and that just gives you that really nice flow through, and that is somewhere that I find it easier to join my fabric. Now, as far as pattern repeat goes, with this particular fabric, you have got the blue flower there and then another blue flower. So if I just pop my hand in between there, that is roughly a hand span. So when we're looking at the pattern repeat, what we have is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blue flowers that are actually visible. And so that would be your first pattern repeat, your second, your third, your fourth, your fifth. And then as we pull up the hem here, you'll see where we've got that fifth pattern repeat. And because the dress doesn't stop there, we go further into it. That gives us our sixth pattern repeat that goes into our hem. So for this dress, we need to calculate 6 pattern repeats. So that is per quarter panel. So we're looking at 6 for this side, 6 for that side, which is 12. So we've got 12 for the front and then also another 12 for the back, which gives us 24 pattern repeats. Now, I don't know the size of the pattern repeat off the top of my head. I can check for you if anyone is interested. But what I did do was that I ordered roughly 3.1 meters, I think it was, or was it 4.1? Either way, I will make sure that the right amount is on the video for what I had ordered in this fabric, but it could have been 4.1 actually. Anyway, so I've ordered that 4.1, yeah, it was probably 4.1 because I think the pattern takes 3. So I did take that extra 25%. Now, I will be completely honest and say that wasn't enough fabric because I wasn't able to get my sleeve out of, or my second sleeve actually out of any of my remaining pieces of the fabric. So again, with pattern match, you can be slightly creative and do joins that you are not going to see. So I've got one perfect sleeve, and if I just turn around my mannequin, what I have here is, I don't know that you will be able to see it, but at the back here, I actually have a join in my sleeve. And I'll try and turn it a little bit further. I actually, as I say, I have a join and you can actually see it through here. So here is my join in my sleeve. And what I've done is that I have pattern matched through the back of that sleeve. So you don't, if you're visibly looking at the sleeve, you don't notice that there is a join. But I didn't have to buy any more fabric. So with pattern matching, yes, you will use slightly more fabric, but you can sometimes get really creative and hide joins within your pattern match. And that's also a really good technique to know. And hopefully, when I'm doing up my cincher dress for the sew along of this video, hopefully I won't quite have enough, and you can see how I've joined something like a sleeve to get enough fabric to actually create enough fabric without buying more. Obviously you can buy more, which is quite easy to do, but sometimes I behave a bit like a cheapskate and I think, no, I can get it out of this will work and I will make it work. If you're making up a garment with a sleeve, something else that you do need to consider within all your pattern placement is, where does that pattern sit on your actual sleeve pattern? Because what you do want is that really nice flow through with your bodice and your sleeve to make sure that your pattern sits, I think, quite evenly in relation to it. And what you will notice here is we've got our blue flower here. So even though it's not perfectly matched with the blue flower there, it's still within line. And also what you will notice quite dominant is that we've got that bit there of that pink flower here. It does sit quite in line with that pink flower over this side. So that comes across as quite something that's in line. So as you can see, I've thought about where the actual placement of my pattern is sitting in relation to all the colours within my bodice. And you will notice it a little bit further down here. Whereas if I just stretch out the bottom of my sleeve here, you should be able to see that blue flower in relation to the blue flower on the bodice. So you've got that flower and it's fairly much sitting bang on in the same sort of position. So what that actually means is, even though with the sleeve that you've got got to remember a sleeve is more of a bell shape that sits into a curve that is more of a scooped shape. You're never going to get that perfectly matched seam all the way through there because of the shaping of the two curves coming together. And there may be a way around that, but I'm not one of those French couturiers that can perhaps let you in to an age-old secret of how one gets around that, because I've got no idea. But what I do try and do is make sure that all my pattern lines up the same way, so it looks neat and it looks really cohesive, and it kind of has that same sort of flow through when you look at it, and you can see that all the colours or all the pattern falls at the same sort of point. Now, how I actually achieve this is that when I've got my pattern piece, so we'll say on my centre, on my front pattern piece and on my back pattern piece, what I will actually do is draw a line from the centre back straight across into that armhole junction point at the side seam. So where your armhole comes out and comes down at the side seam, that is where I will draw my centre line across, and that is my gauge of where my placement line for my pattern will be. And then I draw that same line on my sleeve, and what I do is that I take it from the underarm point all the way across my sleeve. So I've just got that line that goes all the way across, and basically that line is then that underarm point here. So what you will find, being that underarm point through here, is roughly there at the same point. So when it comes to marrying up all those pattern pieces across, your underarm point from that part of your sleeve going down should fall really nicely in line with the pattern of your dress going down that seam there, whether it be the front or the back. And even though it's not going to be, let's say, a perfectly matched shape through here, what you will have is that same flow through of your pattern going around and down your sleeve, which I think is really important, and it just helps to give your garment a really nice, polished, even look. So I guess by now there is a certain question that is coming to your mind, and that is, well, what do I buy first? Do I buy my fabric first, or do I buy my pattern first? And I hate to say, it is a little bit like that age-old question of what came first, the chicken or the egg. And I don't think there has actually been a definitive answer to that. And sadly, I don't have a definitive answer to your question of what do I buy first? Do I buy my fabric first, or do I buy my pattern first? However, on the flip side of that, what I will say is when I did my stint in fashion college, our garment selection was always driven by the fabrics that we were given. So we always started with our fabrics. So our fabric defined what we were going to make. And equally, I guess one way of interpreting that is that if you're looking at a wool fabric, you're not going to make yourself a really lightweight, floaty summer blouse, because a wool fabric is more suited to something like, I'm going to say, an overcoat, where when you're looking at making up your soft, floaty summer blouses, you will consider something more lighter, like a lawn or even a chiffon. So again, I'm going to say that our fabric choice does define the garment that we are going to make. And yes, that can be quite hard on working out where to start when you're thinking, well, what sort of fabric do I like and what am I going to make from it? So where do I start when I'm looking at picking out my next project? Well, I hate to say it, but I kind of have a bit of an amalgamation of ideas. So I'll check out all the community page and see what everyone's doing, and I might have a bit of a vague idea that I'm after a new summer top. So I'll have a look and see what everyone's making. I might check out the new releases patterns from McCall's or Simplicity or Vogue, and I'll see what everyone's made up in those until I get a little bit of inspiration strikes. And then somewhere in between the two do kind of gel, and that's when I go forward with my project. So I don't always you know, think, oh, I know exactly what I'm going to make out of such and such a fabric. And I will be honest, occasionally I have ordered fabric, and yes, I do like a really bold print, and the majority of my fabrics that I do make up are a really bold print, much like my cinchet dress here, as opposed to my little, you know, Hepburn top that I've got going on today in the plain red, which is kind of slightly more in the minority part of my wardrobe. I will pick something that is a really bold pattern. And when I do pick them as a bold pattern, on occasion, I have been known for it to not work. And my fabric turns up and I look at it and I go, yes, I love that, it's perfect. And then I pull out the pattern to which I think I was going to make from it, and somehow the two are just not going to gel. And usually it's to do with the scale of the pattern that I've chosen. So that's the scale of the pattern within the fabric, as opposed to, I'm going to say, the size of the pattern pieces of my garment pattern. And somehow the two do not mesh. And that is where you have to sit down and reevaluate and work out whether or not you're changing your fabric choice or you're changing your pattern choice to get the two to mesh. And that is something that you will come across much more frequently when you are choosing printed fabrics to work with your garment patterns. Now, yet again, I'm going to come back to our cinchet dress and explain why this one is really good for bold patterns. And that is because we have this centre front seam. So you'll be able to join any fabric, whether it be super bold or not so bold or a bit bigger than a ditzy print, quite happily along that centre front seam. It's a slow process, but you will be able to do it, and you will get that really gorgeous flow through all the way across. Then when it comes to your side seam, and what you will find is that mostly you won't be able to get a perfect join through your seam. And with this particular fabric, hold on, where is my side seam? There it is. It doesn't matter that it doesn't join perfectly, because that side seam does get lost within all of the fabric. So, and it's at the side and no one is actually looking at that. But when you do look at a garment centre front on, that is where you want that really nice flow through of your fabric, and that is where it is most important. So when it comes to selecting a pattern to use with a really bold fabric, remember that when you are taking out fitting through here, so if it's got panel lines under the bust or even darts into the top of the skirt, you're never going to get that really cohesive line, because you will only ever get that perfect pattern match if it is a straight line. The moment you start to take area out of that and you try and pattern match it, you are either turning your pattern piece off on a grain line, so it's no longer falling on the correct grain line, and your fabric will twist and distort, if I can ever get that right. So your fabric will be twisted and distorted, so it will never hang right. So what you need to do is, when you are selecting fabric to use with a bold or selecting a bold fabric to use with the dress pattern, you do need to consider where those design lines are to work out whether or not the two will work the best. And we will see that as we have a look at the fabrics that I've picked out and we are placing our cinchet dress on top of those fabrics. Now, I just want to say really quickly about my cinchet dress, because it is quite a big pattern. I've actually chopped off my cinchet dress pattern midway to get a top that will finish somewhere around here. So I am using the top half of my pattern as my lay through most of the video, where you will see how to actually place a pattern piece on the fabric. And then when it comes to cutting out actually our cinchet dress, I will be using the whole pattern piece that you will see as well. So now we're going to start to take a look at some of our fabrics that I've pulled from the website, and I will be completely honest, when I pulled this one I was thinking that it was much more in line with a ditzy print because I was, like you, just viewing it on the website, and then the fabrics get sent to me to do the videos. But when I've got it home and I've taken a closer inspection of it, or I should say when it's arrived, and I've taken a slightly more closer inspection to it, I've actually discovered that this particular fabric has much more of a pattern repeat than what I anticipated. So this particular one has something that is roughly within a 4.5–5 inch pattern repeat. And I have just pinned out my pattern repeat through here. So it's just taking it from this side of the dot over to this side of the dot from where the next one would start. So we've got the beginning to the end of the dot, and then as we come down we have the top of that dot there to the top of that dot and across to there in the same place. And that is actually your pattern repeat, which is, as I said, it roughly falls in line of about 5 inches. And when you're looking at a ditzy print is quite a small scale print, and that is again something that will repeat within, I'm going to say, somewhere from about 2.5, maybe 3 centimeters. So you're looking at something around 1 inch to maybe a 2 inch repeat. So sometimes you get tiny little animals that repeat, or little tiny faces that will repeat, and that is what would be referred to as a ditzy print, or quite a tiny little floral repeat or motif within a small space. So it doesn't have a lot of detail. But this particular one has slightly more detail than what I anticipated, but it's still a really lovely print because it works perfectly for someone who doesn't want to take on, I guess, a big print and wants to start working with print. And also, even though it's got the pattern repeat in it of the 5 inches, it's not as important to perfectly match that particular pattern. So because it looks a little bit more random further away from the eye, you've got that little bit of opportunity to not actually have to perfectly pattern match this particular repeat. So it's allowing you to venture in to, I'm going to say, you know, pattern, and to explore pattern and getting used to using a pattern, but you're not got it on a really big scale. But still, if you want to challenge yourself, equally you could place your pattern down the repeat and get that really nice flow through of the pattern. And if perhaps your sewing is a little bit skewy here and there, it's not going to matter too much, but you'll still get that basic flow through of the pattern, and you can practice your sewing skills with that. Now, I did say we weren't going to have a look at the full size, or going to work with, I should say, the full size cinchet dress pattern for the pattern placement video, because it is quite a big pattern. But needlessly, I did think it was really important that you do have a look at the scale of the pattern in relation to the fabric. Now, the fabric that we've got here, as I said, it's the Art Gallery fabric, so it's a standard quilting cotton width fabric of 110 centimeters. So it is one of the narrowest fabrics that you are going to come across. So as you can see, we have a little bit of space here, and we have a little bit of space there. So without actually measuring the width of the hem, I'm going to hedge my guess and say the circumference of this hem per quarter panel is going to be roughly around 90 centimeters. So it's quite a large area hem in the dress that you're looking at. And if I pull out my trusty little tape measure here, and we measure the top of the pattern all the way down to the bottom of the pattern here. And again, it's quite a long pattern, and it comes up to 126 centimeters. So when you're looking at fabric for this to get a perfect pattern match, you do need 4 times your 126 centimeters. So I'm going to say that's coming back to about 5 meters that you're looking at. And the other thing that I will say is if we move the pattern across slightly, so we pattern match it much closer down the selvage line, it will give us slightly more fabric over here. And by doing that, it will allow us to lap over our pattern pieces as we go to place the next pattern piece. So if this moves over, we then get a tiny amount of room over here, and then when we go to put on our next pattern piece that would sit somewhere within the realm of here, we would able to get a little bit of a lap through here. So you'll probably find that you wouldn't get a huge amount of extra, but you would get that little bit through there where the hem would sit on this one. And so yes, very comfortably you would get your fabric out of 5 meters, or it may even come back to 4.5, depending upon how large your actual pattern repeat was. And the advantage of this particular fabric, only having that 4-inch, 5-inch pattern repeat, is that you don't have a massive pattern repeat to play with. In one of the fabrics that I have chosen, it is a 60 centimeter pattern repeat, so it's quite a hefty pattern repeat to get through the dress, so it is quite overwhelming. Here we have the much smaller scale cinchet dress that I'm now going to refer to as my cinchet top. And just in case you're wondering, where have I chopped my cinchet top dress length to become a top? On my shirring line marked on the pattern, and I have got mine at the 16 size, so I think it was 16 to an 18 size, which is this particular lower line here, and I have added on another 25 centimeters, and I found that that just gives me a long enough length for my top to sit somewhere around my mid hip, which is the length for a top that I'm most comfortable. But you may decide to do it slightly longer or slightly shorter, depending upon the style of top that you like to wear. But I find that 25 centimeters with a 3 centimeter seam allowance works absolutely perfect for me. So when I've placed my top or my dress pattern on my fabric, there is a couple of things that, as we have already spoken about, that you do need to consider. And what I'm going to draw your attention to first is my line that I have on my pattern that takes it across to that underarm junction point that we discussed earlier when it came to pattern matching, because for me that is a really key line that comes through that point there. So it's not quite bust point because of where the darts are on the pattern, but it does give me a really good general idea of where everything is going to fall. So that is why I do draw that particular line, and I use that particular line as a guide on where I want to start my actual pattern matching and move my pattern a little bit up and down from there. So as we spoke about earlier, we've got our pattern repeat here, which is within those 4 squares. So what I have done is that I have picked out one of those repeats, and it's actually the repeat here. So when we take that all the way across, we've got that repeat there, which is what I've taken as the starting point of where to place my pattern. So that is my point, and where I then place my seam allowance, I have then gone through the middle of each one of those markings, and that just makes it really easy to place your pattern piece on your fabric, going within those actual markings on the pattern. And what it should be is, because this line here is dead straight, you will then have a straight grain line as well, which is really important, because if you cut slightly off the straight grain, your top doesn't quite hang the right way and it starts to distort a little bit. So that is really important. Here we have my sleeve pattern, and I've just placed it slightly randomly on the fabric. Well, not quite slightly randomly, but you know what I mean. But either way, you should be able to see we've got that design line that I've written, or that more of a marking line. It's not a design line, but I am using it as a design line for placement on my fabric, so I know where I need to place my pattern piece on my fabric so it falls within the same design line on the pattern repeat. So what we have is this line here, which is actually the same point of the underarm junction, because that is the junction point under the arm between your sleeve, your armhole and your side seam. So that is the line there, and at the same place is where I've actually placed my same line that falls through on my sleeve. So as I said earlier, we've got our line that I've drawn across my sleeve that has gone from those lower points there, and that is the line that I want to use when I am placing my sleeve on my fabric. So that will give me, from that point down, the same pattern repeat on my sleeve to what's on my garment. So it will just keep in a little bit of uniformity within the pattern placement when we are placing our pattern pieces on our fabric. Now, equally, when you are popping on your sleeve, you won't be able to, your sleeve won't fit on your fabric across from here. It's just not going to happen, and you're probably looking at my sleeve going, that sleeve is not in the actual cincher dress. And I am doing a slightly, I'm going to say pattern hacked version. I'm not quite sure that I've got enough fabric, but I am going to give it a go. And what I've done is that I've actually taken the bell sleeve from the night and day dress. So I wanted my make that I'm going to make up as a part of the sew along for my cincher dress. I did really want this time round a long sleeve because we are going into winter here in the UK, and I thought it'd be quite nice to have a long sleeve cincher dress. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I'll have enough fabric to pull that one off, or otherwise it will be back to that short sleeve. You can see now that I've actually placed my second pattern piece on my fabric, and what I have done is that I've taken some of the elements of this particular pattern here. So where we have placed that particular design line for my pattern, between a dot there and a dot there, because it just goes through the middle of the dot, that same line has then gone through exactly the same part of the pattern there. And by using that dot, actually what I've done is that I've got that as my center point, and then when I've lined up my seam allowance, it goes through the middle of those dots on both part of the patterns. So when I go to stitch those patterns together, I will be stitching through the middle of those dots to get my pattern to have that really nice flow. Yes, it's a bit fiddly, yes it takes a bit of work, but it is worth it because you do feel so rewarded by it at the very end. And that is just helping you, that particular design line is really helping you with the placement of where you're going to put your pattern, because you can also draw on that line little bits of the pattern so you know exactly where it is. And also by working from, I'm going to say, the selvage in, you actually get the most or the best utilization of your fabric yardage. Don't be tempted to start placing your pattern somewhere in the middle of your fabric, because you will use even more fabric, and you just need to work, I always find, from the selvage in. So it's something that after you've done a few pattern repeats and cutting stuff and wasting a bit of fabric, you actually realize that that is the most economical way to utilize a pattern fabric, so you're not wasting as much. Now, I wouldn't necessarily cut my top out at this point, or even my dress. But what I have done by drawing up my two pattern pieces like this, I know roughly how much fabric I need. So I'm not going to cut into anything and waste anything and make a mistake, because that is really awful when you're trying to match something, that you cut something wrong and then you're wasting fabric. That will turn you off pattern matching for life. So if you draw up all your pattern pieces in tissue paper and then you're going to place them over your fabric, you will be able to see where they should go and how it should all come together. Now, when I think that I have the correct pattern placement for all my pattern pieces on my fabric, I will cut my first piece first. And then what I will do is actually take this particular pattern piece over to this side of my fabric. Can you see me all the way over here? To this side of the fabric, and I will marry up that seam there with this seam here. And then once I have done that, I will then place my other paper pattern on that part of the fabric to make sure I get the correct flow of all my pattern and my seam allowances are lapped over, and then I will cut out that piece. You will see what I mean by that when we actually do the sew along part of the video. So that is something that when you can actually see it, you will understand it a little bit more. But by placing your pattern pieces like this, it does make it that little bit easier for you to understand how the pattern repeat works. Here I have the second one of our fabrics, and I've pulled from stock a really lovely check, and I do love this in that really soft aqua-y tones. I think it's really beautiful and quite elegant, I'm going to say. I quite like this one. So we've got our check, and we've got lots of variations of a check going on within a check, and this one's quite a nice one because it's actually quite a large scale check, and you will see this type of check predominantly in a lot of, I'm going to say, tailoring or men's fitted shirts. But this one's a great one because it's a bit bigger in scale, so it's a lot easier to have a look at. So when we actually go to take a look at this fabric in a lot closer detail, what you will first notice is actually what you have is 4 primary colours. So we've got our white, our mint, and then our 2 different aqua shades. And those 4 little squares are then defined by this really lovely railroad track design, I'm going to call it, in that slightly darker mint shade, or more darker aqua shade it really is. And then you've got that really gorgeous pink stripe through it, and you look at the pattern and you go, yes, that's what the pattern repeat is. But when you step back from it and you actually look at the fabric, you will notice a couple of things that really do stand out that you don't notice as much when you are just focused on what you think the 4 colours are. And what you notice is that you have smack bang down the middle here, I'm going to say, we'll do it this one here. We have a really dominant dark stripe where you've got that dark aqua shade that pops out at you. And then I'm going to say the next slightly lighter aqua shade and the white. To me, it just sort of blurs a little bit. You don't really notice it. But then you notice this next really defined stripe here, which comes across as much more of a white stripe, because you've got the white and that really pale minty colour. Again, you've got the repeat of your paler mint and the white. Again, moving along, you've got that darker stripe. So you've almost got within your check design those really defined striped lines as well. So you can see that with your stripe, your pattern also kind of goes from here across to here, because you've got that variation as well within that colourway of just that as well. And it's almost like it's repeating that style across that is giving you those slightly more dominant lines within it. So I guess that's where you kind of get your checks and your stripes that merge together. But then when you look at a fabric like this, I guess the question that comes to mind is, well, where the hell do I actually pattern match it, and how do I pattern match it? And I'm going to try and say, don't overthink it, because the first time you start overthinking it, you'll get confused and it will just be too much. So I would kind of pick something that I like as my stripe, and you can either start on that center stripe down through the middle there, being the dark one, or you could start with something that's white. So you've got quite a few different options to think about. Or equally, you might just like to pick something down on that particular line through here. And if I was pattern matching, I have to be honest, this is the line that I would choose to place my center front on. And then with regards to the other colorways, just kind of do what you like the best. So you might want to even consider starting down through the center of there as your stripe, but I do think that paler pink is a little bit harder to match, and it would be a lot easier to pattern match through that particular stripe through there. And if you're really unsure of where and how to start at a center point, a really good indication is to have a look at the selvage, and you will see along the selvage you've got that particular railroad track stripe. So I would define that selvage as the perfect place to work from as your center point down the front of whatever you were going to make, by taking it from the selvage, and then you just work out what you like as your most dominant colour and where that is going to sit on the body. Now, I've laid out my pattern piece on my fabric, and as I said, I do like that particular line through that particular stripe as my centre front. So I've popped my centre front line down through the middle of that line there. So that is where I want to have my centre front seam and where the fabric is going to be joined. Now, a couple of things that you do need to take into consideration from once where you have decided where that centre front line is going to be is where all the other design lines of your check fall on the body. So when I've looked at this, I've moved it up and down a couple of times, and what we have here is a really good example of maybe what you'd like to do, or maybe not what you would like to do. So starting at the neck edge here, so we've got our 15mm seam allowance here and our 15mm seam allowance within down from the neck edge, and where that sits is bang on our stripe here. So we've got a stripe here, so when we're visibly wearing the garment, what we're going to have is a row of stripe at the base of the neck right there. And obviously with the cincture dress, you have got that placket detail down the front. But equally, if you are making a shirt or a different type of top, do you want to have a centre front seam down the front of it, and then also having to join and making sure those seams match perfectly, or that design line of your fabric matches perfectly, smack bang in at eye level across there? Because I don't know about you, but whenever I see someone in stripes when I'm out and around, I have to try and not stare at them, because I'm picking out, I hate to say it, all the mistakes in the stripe of the fabric when it's been stitched together and someone is wearing it. Now obviously the majority of these stripe fabrics that one sees out and around with people wearing them, I am going to term them as mass market clothing. So within the mass market clothing, you're not going to get perfectly matched stripes unless you start going further up the scale and you're seeing someone out and around in something that is really expensive or a designer label, and that is where you will start to see those beautifully matched stripes. So that is one thing that you do need to consider, is when you're laying out a shirt pattern that has a seam or a detail at the centre front, right bang there, do you want to have that sort of stripe there? Is it going to look aesthetically pleasing when it's finished? Do you have the skill to actually manage that seam right there to make sure it looks really, really beautiful, or is it going to be something that's going to drive you completely up the wall because you don't like the look of it and it doesn't look really perfect? So that's all the things that you've got to stop and ask yourself before you even take scissors to your fabric. And that's just one tiny element of it. And then, as I say, the design line that I have marked in at my underarm point, again, I've put that in there on the pink just because it was really nice and easy, and it makes it easy to pattern match when it comes to popping on my other front and also my sleeve, because I know I've got that line through there, which is going to make placing your pattern on the fabric really easy. Then the other thing that you need to consider is obviously the length of your garment and where your finished length will finish in relation to the placement of your stripes or your pattern. And as you can see here, I have made sure that that falls right on that part of the actual check. So I get the full aqua check and I get none of that other part of the check because that will fall into my seam allowance. So when we have the centre front of the garment, you will see here you've got 1, 2, 3. So you're going to have 6 full squares across the lower half of your garment there, because again, if you were to move it up or down slightly, you might find that it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. So what you might find is that if you were to finish it, for instance, on the narrow stripe like that, it could look a little bit odd and not quite as nice. If you're someone like me who's perhaps a little bit bigger, it could get lost and it will give you a narrow band there that may not give you the most attractive look across your hip, and it may draw attention to your hip, which you don't want to do. You know, if you're someone like me who's perhaps a little bit bigger, or if you're someone that's slimmer, that might work really well for you because it's making that part of your body look a little bit bigger if you're someone who doesn't have hips. So again, you need to play a little bit with your fabric placement to get the best out of it to suit your body shape. And equally, if it was halfway down through that square, it might look a bit odd. So there are 3 really key things that you need to think about when you are placing your pattern on your fabric, and where those bits on the fabric are going to sit on you, and whether or not you're happy for them to sit on you there. And also, with it being a centre front seam, are you feeling confident enough to perfectly match all those tiny little stripes, or are you better off to bring that a little bit further down and then maybe shorten your top a little bit? So these are little elements that you need to think about when you are actually placing your pattern on your fabric before you even take your scissors to it to chop it out. When you're working out where to place your sleeve on your check or your stripe fabric, I guess you have a little bit of the easy work done for you by using that pink stripe across here, that design line, because as we spoke about earlier, as we've got our underarm junction point there in our bodice, that is where it's going to match at our sleeve point. So we've got that junction through there. So when you're looking at the placement of the stripes on the body, and you've got your arms down in your top or your dress or whatever you're making in your striped coat, you will have, or your striped outfit, you will have all your stripes falling at the same point across the body. So again, you've got all those pink stripes that are going to be in line, and that is how they're all going to work really beautifully. They're all going to fall in line. Now, the other thing that you need to consider is what is going to be your center grain line through your sleeve, because if we have a look at our junction point here, and what we have is our junction point here is actually in a little green pale minty square, and we're quite lucky that that one kind of falls in a pale minty square as well. And then as we go around our sleeve head or our sleeve line of our bodice, we then have a little bit of white and a little bit of that darker green. So we've kind of missed the white because the sleeve head's that little bit higher, and then we go into that minty green followed by the white, and then our sleeve point here comes up here. So the head of our sleeve is going to be white. But what we do have is at our stitching point, right in that corner, we do have a pink stripe. So the center of our sleeve is actually going to be that pink stripe. So where your sleeve actually meets here, we have a pink stripe, and then we've got that pink stripe going all the way down the center of your sleeve. So that is something else that you want to consider, is where you're going to have the dominant stripe through your sleeve as well. So there again, all different elements that you do need to take into consideration of where to place your pattern on your fabric to get all those things to work together really. Here we have our last of the art gallery prints, and it is this absolute amazing bohemian patchwork inspired print that I absolutely love. And this is the fabric that I am going to make up my cincher dress in as a part of the sew along with the pattern match video. Now, yes, this is an amazing, hugely overwhelming fabric when we do look at it, because there is so much going on with it. And it is a really, really deep pattern repeat. If we're looking at this part of the pattern here, all the way down to the pattern here, it is actually a 60 centimetre repeat. So it is really, really big, and it's going to be massively overwhelming. And I have to say that is part of the charm, I'm going to go with it, for my cincher dress, because I do think this particular pattern, because it is so large in scale, will be absolutely perfect for my cincher dress, because that dress does have very few actual design lines. As I said, the pattern repeat from the top to there is 60 centimetres. And also when we look at the pattern repeat, say from here all the way across to here, that is also 65 centimetres. So this particular pattern repeat within this fabric, it takes up the majority of the fabric. So it does throw up a few really interesting challenges onto where and how to lay up your pattern on a fabric like this, because obviously the fabric is quite a large scale, and you sort of think, yes, you do need a pattern or a garment pattern that again is going to allow you to place as much of that pattern on this fabric without cutting in to any more of this design, because you really want this actual fabric to shine more than anything in any one of the other fabrics that we've had a look at, because this fabric is truly an amazing statement fabric, and it will make up into an amazing statement garment. Now, as I have previously said, when you're looking at placing your garment pattern on your fabric pattern, you do need to start as close as you possibly can to the selvage. And I'm going to say that is, within this particular fabric, that is even more key, because you want to get as much of the fabric, you want to utilize as much as the fabric as you can. And because of the scale of the pattern repeat and it being so large, it does mean that you have to kind of work as well within that constraint to make sure that everything works really beautifully together. Previously, when you have seen me lay out the pattern pieces on the fabric, I'm going to say, kind of cheated and gone with really obvious and easy design lines to lay out the pattern pieces. And if we were to look at this piece of fabric, the most obvious place to place the pattern piece is along this particular design line all the way across through here. But the problem is with placing this particular pattern piece on that line is that that line is not going to look very flattering on the body, and I don't think that particular line will work on me, because obviously when I'm placing my pattern pieces, I am thinking about how that actual fabric is going to sit on the body. So what I have done is that I have changed that line a little bit, and by obviously moving that line up, it is going to make it a little bit harder for me to work out where my sleeve should sit in the rest of my fabric. So I will have to allow a couple of other different design lines on my sleeve, because I do have this really nice solid line here. So that line I will transfer on my sleeve to make it much easier to actually place my sleeve on my fabric. And the other thing that I've done is that when I've placed my neck on my fabric, my neck point, junction point, is falling in line with that particular point there. So I think that will give it a really nice shape down through the center front. So obviously you've got a little bit of asymmetricalness going on with the shape of the fabric, but these are all actually part of the design of the fabric that you need to work with to get the right pattern placement on the body for you as well. I've just popped up my sleeve and I've made sure that I have got the underarm line marking on my sleeve is at the same point as that underarm marking design line on the bodice. So we've got that continual flow all the way across, and we know that by having that line marked and it being at the same point, we're going to get that same part of that pattern repeat on the sleeve as what we have on our main part of the garment. So we will have a nice amount of uniformity of the pattern. And when it comes to selecting the center point of your pattern, because of your sleeve of your pattern, I should say, I'm not going to worry too much about what's going on up here, because this pattern is so busy, I don't think it really matters. But what we do want to make sure is that we have some sort of center line through the actual sleeve. And at the top here, where I've actually got this, and I've done this without really thinking about it, I have to be honest, we have a junction point here which gives me a black line. So again, through here we actually have a solid black line at the top there. So that is where I've chosen to mark up the center point of my sleeve. So that will have that center point there where you've got the black line, and that black line again will flow through that part of the sleeve and finish down the end there. So here we are having a look at the cincher dress laid out on the fabric, and as you can see, it is a really big pattern piece, and also the fabric is really big as well. So it did give me a little bit of a challenge to kind of show you, or to work out the best way to show you how I would lay up a pattern of this scale, because it is really quite big. And even though here now we have half a pattern, so we've got the lower half of one and the top half of the other, I thought it was really important just to show you where it falls on those seams, is where we have what is going to be our stitching line, because what I've done is that I've folded back my seam allowance, and through here you can see that that is going to be my stitching line when I go to stitch my two fronts together. So that particular line there goes all the way down, and that is where I will be joining my two fronts together, and further across that line I will have my seam allowance. So here, as you can see, we have the left hand side, and then as I come across here we now have my right hand side front. And again, what I've done is that I've folded back that seam allowance, and you have got another part of the pattern underneath there. Here's the right hand front of my cincher dress, and you can see it is quite a long pattern, and that's why through most of the video I've been dealing with the slightly shorter version, or not quite able to see as much of the full dress. So what we have here is I've got my right hand front pinned to my fabric, and as you can see I have got that little point at the top there as my center point under my neck, and I have just folded back my seam allowance, and you can see here where we just turn back that seam allowance, you can see that particular line through there all the way down there and down there, that is going to be my stitching line, so that is actually the center front of my garment. Now once I've cut out my first front, whether or not it's the left or the right, whatever way you want to work with, I then get that cut piece of fabric and I mirror it up to this piece of fabric here. Once my fabric is all lined up, I will then place back on my paper pattern so I can accurately cut out the other front of my dress. I thought we would just talk about sleeve placement really quickly and show you the sleeves on the fabric and where I'm going to actually place them on the fabric to cut them out. Now, as I've said, I would normally place my underarm point along that particular line there because it's a nice solid line and it's really easy, that just stands out. But for this particular make, I decided to move it up about 9.5–10 centimeters further up, and I've just marked it there, which is the underarm point on my fabric if we were to come across here, that's actually on my dress pattern, because that actual piece there is actually the left hand front of my cinchered dress. So that would be my underarm point, and I've now just moved it down to here because it's a little bit easier to see, and I'm going to place on my the actual sleeve to the popover dress. Just to show you what the actual sleeve that goes with the cinchered dress looks like, I've grabbed mine out from my pattern pack, and you can see here that we've got quite a large gathered head on the sleeve, and then it is where we've got that underarm point that I've marked on all my pattern pieces to make sure that the lower portion of your sleeve is all in line with whatever is on the body. Again, you can see it here that I've got that underarm point there. That bit there is going to be in the same portion as what is on the body of your dress, and then here you're going to have all that same sort of pattern is going to be at the same height all through the top here. So again, you get that really nice uniformed look, even though that this sleeve is quite a gathered sleeve. And what I would say is, depending upon how much fabric you've got and what your pattern placement is, you will have a little bit more to play with than what I've had within this particular make, because obviously my pattern repeat's quite large in this fabric. It's 60 centimeters. That makes it really easy to see what a pattern repeat looks like, but it is a lot more restrictive in how I get to play with my fabric scraps, because I don't actually have any fabric scraps to kind of work with my sleeve. And on top of that 5 meters that I do need to make my cinchered dress within this particular fabric, I also then need additional fabric to actually cut out my sleeve, or more importantly, to cut my sleeve how I really want to cut my sleeve. You can see here with the sleeve that I'm making for my long version cinchered dress with the night and day bishop sleeve, or the bell style sleeve that it comes with, you do have quite a lot of fabric that is needed. So when it comes to actually placing this particular pattern piece on my fabric, especially using this really lovely bohemian fabric, it becomes a few challenges onto where you're going to place the center part of your sleeve. And normally what I would have done is placed it down that particular line there as the center point of my sleeve, but due to the placement of that actual part of that pattern, and it's so close to each one of the edges, I don't actually have enough fabric to do that. So what I have done is, again, I've stayed with my underarm level, which is here, I should say. So that is my underarm level through there, and that will give me the same underarm point as what's on my dress. So the top half of my sleeve head will be exactly the same sort of uniformity of the pattern, and then the lower half of my sleeve will then be the same sort of uniformity of my pattern as well. But I have placed it sort of in the middle somewhere. So we've got a little bit of a solid line through here. Not much of a solid line. We've just got that tiny bit of that pink line. But you can see we're going to have a nice spread of our pattern through our sleeve to make sure we do get that really lovely uniformity. And the one thing that I will mention, if you are cutting up your sleeve in a single lay like this, do remember to flip your sleeve. So you obviously get a right sleeve and a left sleeve, as opposed to perhaps two right sleeves or two left sleeves. So once you've cut one side of your pattern, I tend to put a big cross on that, so I know the other side of my pattern I do need to cut when it comes to laying up that second sleeve. The first thing that I like to do when it comes to pattern matching a seam on anything is that what I do is that I draw in 2 widths of my seam allowance as a pencil line in from the cut edge. So what we have here is our centre front of our cinchet dress, and what I do is that I get my trusty little grading ruler and I draw in a line 3 centimetres in all the way down. So that line will go from the hem all the way up to my notch point there. And what this line is, it's 2 widths of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance that we're working with is 15 mil. And what I will do is, once I have penciled in that line, I will then turn back my raw edge to that pencil line, and I am going to press in that raw edge all the way along. So I'm going to take it off to the iron and press in that seam. Now, we only need to fold over and press one seam. So it doesn't matter which seam it is, it's whatever seam works for you. And then what we do is we place one seam on top of each other. So by doing it this way, what you've got is a perfect fold line that will be your stitching line, and what we need to do is marry up this particular line all the way down through there. So it's a little bit painstaking, I have to be honest, and it is a little bit fiddly. So I might start with my most dominant bit of my pattern between here and here, and what I'm going to do is that I'm going to pin this into position, and then I'm going to stitch that. So you can see here the first bit of our pattern match is done, and what I have done is that I have got folded under one part of the print. So we've folded under from the grey line underneath on one side there, and then what I have done is placed, I'll just flip this over, and what I have done is placed that fold line just inside of that grey line there to give me that really nice placement all the way down there. Once I've completed the first section of my pattern match, I will then continue on to the next most dominant section of my pattern and pattern match that. And I do find by working in sections, I get a much more cleaner result and a much neater result to get that perfect pattern match. And here we have another really loud, colourful fabric. And I have to be completely honest, nothing excites me more when it comes to sewing and finding a really gorgeous floral print, and especially a Hawaiian or a tiki inspired floral print. They are absolutely some of my favourite fabrics, and this one here just brings a complete smile to my face, and I just want to make all sorts of dresses out of this one because I do absolutely love this Robert Kaufman fabric in this really, really gorgeous hibiscus flower design. I absolutely love in this one the pops of colour, the yellow, the orange, the green, the blue. It's just got so much going on with it. And as I say, I really do adore the really gorgeous hibiscus flowers and the birds of paradise that feature in all the Hawaiian prints, and the beautiful plumeria flowers as well. I absolutely love them, and I do get really excited when it comes to making up a fabric like this. When you look at a fabric like this, you wouldn't really take into much consideration what the type of the pattern repeat is, because you don't really consider trying to pattern match a floral. Well, some of us do, and some of us do take pattern matching our florals incredibly seriously, because, you know, if we love them, we want to make sure that what we're making out of our floral is absolutely amazing, and we're getting some really gorgeous panel line seam flow through with our design, because we don't want to miss out on any one of the really gorgeous flowers that are going on in a print like this. Now, when we take a look at the actual pattern repeat within this one, surprisingly, again, when you look at it on the website, it's not as obvious as perhaps the last one was, that it's going to have a really dominant pattern repeat in it, because the last one that we looked at was so geometric, it was really glaringly obvious that it was quite a serious pattern going on in that. And within this one, all you do see is a bunch of flowers going all sorts of different ways. So you just think, yep, gorgeous floral, got to have it. But when you take a closer look at it, you will find that again we've got a pattern repeat going on. So the pattern repeat I'm going to take from this one gorgeous birds of paradise flower here. So we've got that flower and the top stem of it there all the way down through to the next one of that flower down here is quite a long distance, and again it comes back to 59 centimeters. So where you looked at the last one and thought, oh my god, that's quite a scary pattern repeat, so is this one. There is quite a lot that goes on between here and here with that pattern repeat. And again, if we take it from the side of the selvage here of the start of the pattern repeat, looking at this really gorgeous hibiscus flower here, the next actual same flower of that one is actually all the way over here. So again, you're looking at that particular distance from there to there is something like 62 centimeters, and you wouldn't necessarily take into account at how large that pattern repeat is. And I have to be honest, as someone who looks at a fabric like this and thinks, yep, I want to cut this up in a skirt, and someone who probably cuts their skirts quite often around 68 or 75 centimeters if I'm having like a full gathered skirt, that pattern repeat is really important, because if you're gathering up a fabric like this to actually have it as a full gathered skirt around this area, you want to make sure that you're lining up that part of the pattern there at the same point when you cut into that, and then you're cutting the next bit down there, because if you don't, you will find all your flowers are kind of at a different level. And even though that might not be a big thing to some people, I think the more you sew and the more that you understand how pattern repeat works and how these really strange, quite tiny little elements can annoy someone that sews, because you're thinking, oh my god, I can see that my pattern repeat's not right, it's not all the way around, I notice it on my hem. These are all really strange things that the more you sew and the more experience that you gain, the more these sort of really strange things crop up and annoy one. Now, as I said, if I was going to chop up this particular fabric into something like a skirt, and because we've got our pattern repeat here at 59 centimeters, that actually means that I have to fall within that pattern repeat really nicely. I actually have to make sure that my skirt length is no more than 59 centimeters, with that being I'm going to say, with all my hem allowances in it. And for me, that's just not going to happen because, as I say, a lot of mine get cut around 68 or 75, depending upon the length and how much hem I'm going to have within the actual garment. And when you start to take into that account, you're then cutting into that next part of the actual print. And you end up with a whole bunch of, I'm going to say, strips through here. And if you were cutting it up to make a dress with a bodice or something, if I was going to tackle a fabric like this, strangely enough, I would probably start with my skirt first and cut that out, and then work within my scraps of actually trying to get together my bodice pieces, because I will find that way, strangely enough, even with a little bit of creative pattern matching, if I have to join a couple of odd seams a bit creatively to get it all to work, that is a much more, I'm going to say, cost-effective way of doing it, because if I need to actually buy any more fabric, if I was having to buy another piece for a skirt and I didn't know where it came off the roll, I would be looking at least at 1 metre. But if I had to buy just a bit for a bodice, I'd probably still be looking at going, oh, actually, I could go for something like maybe 75 centimetres or 80 centimetres, and I should have enough and be able to perfectly pattern match whatever bit is actually missing from my bodice. The great thing by working with a floral, I guess, on such a large scale that this one is, because it does come across as a completely random design, you can essentially lay out your pattern pieces wherever you want on it and quite happily chop away. But do take into a little bit of consideration where those key elements of your pattern repeat do lie within the fabric, and onto your actual pattern pieces, because even though with something like this, to be honest, it doesn't really matter where any one of those flowers fall upon your body and how they sit, because they are relatively quite small in scale, so they're not going to be hugely dominating, but there is quite a lot of them, so it's still going to be a really dominant pattern. And you do need to take in a little bit of consideration, I would say, to where those, again, main seam lines are going to lie, because you will want to try and achieve some sort of pattern match within your garment, still with a fabric like this, just to make sure it looks really cohesive and, of course, really beautiful and pleasing to the eye. Here I have the top version of our cinchette dress on our fabric, and I have placed it as close as I can to the selvage, and you will notice here we've got our top of our Birds of Paradise flower, and then if you just look through the tissue paper, you will see the other Birds of Paradise flower there. And again, this really demonstrates that even with something like this that is quite a long pattern repeat, you are still falling into the second pattern repeat, even for the top version of our cinchette dress. So if you were going to make up the cinchette top, I'm going to call it, in this particular fabric, you would need to allow that full 2 pattern repeats to get that really gorgeous continual flow of your actual fabric design across your front and across your back, so it is all really nice and lovely and uniformed. If I was going to make up my cinchette dress within this fabric, I would say that I am allowing something like 3 pattern repeats per quarter panel, and that does come back to a really quite costly make in anyone's terms. So, you know, you might think twice about making up this particular fabric in a dress like the cinchette dress, purely because of the amount of fabric that you need. But if you allowed, I'm going to say, 2 pattern repeats per quarter panel, and you took your time and you actually cut it out, you could probably just about get away with it, with maybe shaving a little bit of length off the dress to get it back to fit comfortably within the 2 pattern repeats. And also do remember that your hem has a slight curve to it. So equally, you could find that you can move up those pattern pieces slightly to get a fuller placement of your pattern. And I would say, because this is such a really gorgeous tropical summer fabric, I would probably be making my cinched dress as a sleeveless version, because I think even in this fabric it would look really gorgeous as a sleeveless version, with even that really nice lovely high collar. Or perhaps you might want to scoop out the collar and have it slightly more of a rounded style for a summer dress that could be really easily done in this fabric. Now, if you were going to put your sleeve on your dress that you were making, you do need to make sure that you've got your sleeve going along at the same line. So it doesn't matter what garment you have chosen to make out of this fabric, just make sure again you've got that nice even line at that underarm point, so you know that that's the perfect placement for your pattern, for it to fall, so it is all in line with what you've got on your sleeve to what you're wearing on your body, and it just gives it that really lovely polished look. But equally, if you were on a budget, because some fabrics are quite more expensive than others, and you were just really focusing on actually cutting your centre fronts, or because you've got those really nice seams that are visible there and you just wanted to make sure that they were perfect and you pattern matched that, you could quite happily in this fabric fairly much place your sleeve anywhere, and it wouldn't necessarily look out of incorrect, I'm going to say, or out of place. It just becomes a matter of preference of what one likes to do as they polish their sewing skills. And as their sewing skills get a lot better, you will find that you do get a little bit more picky about where you place your patterns on your fabric to get that really nice finished look to your garments that make them look extra special even. And I guess someone doesn't even look at it and thinks that it's homemade. They just look at what you're wearing and go, oh my god, that's amazing. And then when you turn around and say, yeah, I made it, and their jaw drops even more, because if they're someone who's perhaps new to sewing or kind of sews, you do kind of leave people in awe with all these really tiny details that really do make one's sewing super, super polished. Here we have a really gorgeous Pebble design print, I'm going to call this, because within the print we've got all tiny little motifs and they remind me of pebbles. And this really gorgeous fabric comes from Lady McElroy, and it's just really gorgeous and elegant in the blue and the navy on this white crisp background, and you think, yeah, that is really gorgeous. I really love that. That's not going to be too scary to take on as my first pattern match exercise of dipping my toe into the water of working with a pattern fabric. However, before you commit yourself with this one, take a bit of a deep breath, because it does have a little bit of a sting in its tail that one doesn't quite pick up when they first look at it. Now, if we take a look at the fabric, what I've done is that I've marked out here this really gorgeous little square that you think, yeah, that's the pattern repeat, not a problem. We've got something that is 10 centimetres by 15 centimetres, nice, easy, not a problem whatsoever. But then when we look at the next bit underneath, what we also have is a slightly different version of dots, which kind of sits above and below the other one. So you've got that one there and you've got that one there. So then your pattern repeat then comes down to there. So we're probably looking at something much more closer to, I haven't measured it, I have to be honest. So I'm going to say somewhere around 15 by 20, because that's 10, no, probably be 15 by 17, I'm going to say, to hedge my guess, 15 by 17, because I don't think that's quite a 20 centimetre square. So that's what you think is your pattern repeat. But then the next problem is, as you look closer at this pattern, where you've got got that really lovely little square there and you go all the way down to the next one, what happens is that particular square there moves over one, and then the pattern moves over. So not only do you have this really gorgeous style, and then you've got that other railroad kind of pebble design going through there, the pebble dash bit I'm going to call it, the main part of the pattern moves over one, and you will find that that happens all the way down. So what you've got is your really gorgeous square of your 15 by 10. Then you've got something that's probably 7 by 10, where you've got a different variation of your little bits of the pebbles going on. And then instead of that sitting really nicely under there, it moves one. So it kind of moves, not quite like a checkerboard, but a bit like a checkerboard. I don't quite know how else to describe it, but it constantly is moving through the different rows. And you will find that you've got that there, and then that moves there, and then as you go down with your next part of your pattern there, and it all moves over one, and again you've got your railroad design, the next part of that moves over one there. So it constantly keeps moving, keeps evolving to keep you on your toes when it comes to cutting out a fabric like this. So yes, you may first off look at it and go, yep, got that, really nice and easy, and you will start to cut into the fabric, and I hate to say it is one that you might possibly screw up into a ball and swear at a little bit. I have to be honest, it's kind of got that vibe about it, purely because of the fact it is literally one colour, I'm going to say, because we've got, even though we've got that 2 different shades of blue on it, when you start to look at this, you will look at it and go, oh my God, all I keep seeing is blue and different bits of blue. But the other advantage of this one, because it is kind of a movable pattern, you could quite happily cut this one out and not actually even pattern match it, because it has such a tiny random thing going on about it. And because you've got those little inch squares of the pebbles that are so different, not only would you not have to actually perfectly pattern match it like you would some of the other fabrics, because you're not going to notice it, but what you would want when you are making up a garment in this one is you would kind of want to try and keep that railroad design line at the same point through the body on all your pattern pieces. So if you were drawing up that particular line on all your pattern pieces, whether or not it be a shirt like the cinchet one that we've had a look at, or the cinchet dress, or perhaps a fitted shirt or something like that, or whatever you want to make from this fabric, the one thing that I would say is make sure that you do draw on that particular line of where you want, or your that railroad part of the fabric to sit on the body or on your pattern piece, because at least that will give it a little bit of uniformity instead of maybe having it all a little bit higgledy-piggledy. But then again, with this one, higgledy-piggledy is actually going to work a treat, because you're not going to notice it. It's not going to look like it's a mistake, because you can work with the fabric and you can quite happily cut into it any way, shape that you may like. But if you do try and pattern match it, it might drive you seriously up the wall. So for argument's sake, I have popped my cinchet dress top on top of the fabric, just so we can have a bit of a look to see where we would place that centre front line. And what I've done is that I've taken my centre front line through that part, so it's in between 2 parts of the pattern. So we've got that bit of a line of that pebble pattern, and we've just placed it there. So that makes that centre front seam, or any visible seam that is taking dominant place in this fabric at the front of you, that will be a really nice easy seam, because it will look like the actual pattern pieces are going to be continual, and even though you have taken the time to cut it that way, the sewing process through that seam will be really quite easy. And also because of the fact that you've got so many variations of the different pattern with this one, if you were making it up into a really nice fitted dress, it would look really great, because where you're taking away bits of the fabric through perhaps your dart fitting, especially through your bust darts through the body, it will work really nicely, because that area, because it is so small, it's those darts that you take away are still going to give it that really nice uniformed flow. But what you will need to remember is to make sure that the pieces that you place next to it, so it goes around the body, are all really uniformed, so you've got in the same place that little main part of our pattern repeat and then that little railroad track, because you will want that to all fall at the same point on the body, because again, if you're making it up, it could look a little bit disjointed by not having that continual flow through the pattern. Now, when it comes to placing a sleeve on a piece of fabric like this, again, I would follow that design line or that underarm line, whatever you want to call it, at the same point on the body, so the lower half of the sleeve will have that same continual flow as what your garment has, so you get that really lovely uniformed look. And then as for where you place it across the fabric, I'm going to say with this one, it doesn't really matter, because I think with this, you can obviously go through the middle of something because it will be really easy to line up. You could go through the middle of a square. You could do anything and place it anywhere along there, and it wouldn't even matter if both of your sleeves were not quite symmetrical, as long as your sleeve points fell at the same part through the body. So depending upon how much fabric you've got, how you're doing your lay, what sort of garment that you're making, as long as your sleeve, your underarm sleeve point all fell at the same point as what your garment part of your fabric does, then wherever you have the space left on your fabric, anywhere across there is where you could actually place your sleeve. So you've got a little bit more creativity and a little bit more flexibility, I think, even within this fabric. But still, there are a couple of elements that you would want to continue with to make sure you get the most polished finish with your handmade garments that you can. We have our last fabric as a part of the pattern match video, and yeah, I'm gonna have to say I love this one. I do. It's probably a bit predictable, but I do love this one. I just think it's really bright and it's really colourful. And even though my husband has defined these faces as slightly scary, I still quite like it. But then again, I do like a bit of fun colour, and that is what this fabric is from Little Johnny. It's just fun and it's a great splash of colour. Now, this one here is actually the widest one out of all the fabrics that we've had a look at. This one here is 150 centimetres, which I think off the top of my head is around 54 inches. So this one here, it actually has the advantage as well, I'm going to say, of being the cheapest one and the widest one out of all of the fabrics that we've had a look at. So this is, I'm going to say, the perfect fabric for you to take on and practice your pattern match skills. Now, as for the pattern repeat for this one, I am going to say I'm going to put it out there and say it's possibly the easiest one out of all of them, because when you look at this particular fabric, there are only 2 patterns on this fabric, and you have 2 different types of faces. So even though the colourway is slightly different within both of the faces, there are only the 2 faces. And also what you will have between the 2 faces, because they're kind of set offset from each other, so you've got your row of your green one here, then you've got your row of your tealy aqua one through there. What you will find is that even though they're offset, this fabric is going to be relatively easy to work with. Now, if we take a closer look at the actual faces through here, as I've said, you've got your two green ones here, and then you've got your aqua one that is offset in between it, and that is kind of how your pattern actually works. So if we were to take perhaps the top of one through to the bottom of the other, so you've got a row of 3 green faces, and I think that roughly comes back to about 30 centimetres. And then when you go across from one to the other there, that is about 19 centimetres, I think it was. So the pattern repeat is quite small, and obviously if you were looking at it in more of an area like that, which is the top of there to there and across, it will come back even much smaller. But I do think if you're looking at this one as a fabric, you do kind of need to take into account the faces and how they all sit, because that's going to be really key to what you do with this fabric and how you actually lay up any garment pattern that you choose to make out of this particular fabric. So with this one, where would you actually place your garment pattern? It's quite a difficult one, because obviously you want to see what those faces are going to look like on you in relation to the body, and also where are you going to place that centre front seam or your centre back seam, or whatever your key seams are, because either way you're going to have something down the centre front, whether or not you're making the cincher dress or whether or not you're going to make something else out of this, because what you want to work out is whether or not you're going to have a row of faces, whether or not they be, I'm going to say, the green one, or whether or not you want it as more of the teal one, because they are going to sit somewhere on your body down the centre front. And I guess what you need to do is actually play with it a little bit with this fabric on the body. So wrap it around yourself, hang it in front of a mirror and stand there and kind of work out where and how you want those faces to look. Okay, so I've placed on my pattern, and I've placed my pattern actually where I think the easiest place to stitch that centre front seam, and I have gone down between that row of faces through there. So it's on that panel line or that pattern placement line through there, because I think that is going to be really nice and easy to sew, because it's, you know, you're in between the two and you're not going to have to worry too much about joining all those colours exactly if you go down through the centre front of one of the noses, because I think that could be a little bit harder for someone to stitch if they're not used to doing a lot of pattern matching, and it can be quite a long task to do, because you will have to do it in sections to make sure that you get that really nice flow and you're not getting any disjointed faces down through the front of whatever you're making. So that's why I did choose to put it in between that line there, because it's got a little bit more forgiving. So that's why I've chosen that line there. But the problem with that is when we have a look at the neckline, and again, the cincher dress is a really good example of this, because you're looking at something that's a high neck, and obviously if you had a lower neck or a different shaped neckline or something that wasn't sitting right here, you've then got a full face one side of your neck and half a face the other side, because when you flip that pattern over, when it's the other half of that pattern piece is going to go through here. So you're going to have one face and then half a face and a mouth. Now, is that going to look aesthetically pleasing? Am I going to like that? I don't know. That's the thing. I don't know. Now, I've just popped on the other pattern piece. So we've got here basically the whole front of what's going to be our cinched dress or our cinched top or whatever. And as I said, if you have a look at the neckline, and obviously on the cinched dress it's quite a high neckline, but again, there obviously other necklines and other patterns are going to sit differently, but it's still giving you something to think about. Because as I said, when we had a look at the mirror image here, you can see, even though I've got my seam allowance through there, you've actually got half a head. So when you're thinking about it, what you're actually got on your neckline, it's going to be something through there like that. So is that going to be really aesthetically pleasing that high at the neck? Or are you actually better to place your fabric a little bit further down in a different position and actually have your center front through that particular line there, where at the neck you're either going to have a white gap and then something that's going to sit down a little bit further as a full face, so it's not as high up and it just sits that little bit further, because you can place your pattern piece with your seam allowance sitting there, for instance, that being your stitching line and your seam allowance going up into the face. Then you've got that gap and then you've got that particular line down the front. So you know, it's quite difficult, because first off I look at it and go, yep, I want to stitch it down through that seam because it'll be really nice and easy to stitch. But then when I think about what that is actually going to look like when I mirror image out my pattern, it's very much like, actually I don't like the look of that, and I need to really think about how and where I'm going to place my pattern piece, because I want to make sure that that design line around my neck sits really nicely, and I don't like that half face and that sitting there. I just don't think that that looks really aesthetically pleasing. But it doesn't really matter whether or not you've got something that's going to be quite low or maybe a bit high like this one. That is an element that you really do need to think about, because when you first look at it you think, yep, I'm going to place my pattern piece there, and because the fabric is so large and you're thinking, oh, it's not a big pattern repeat, I've ordered 4 meters, yep, I'm quite happy, I'll start chopping it up, here we go. You may actually then discover, once you've cut it all out and you're starting to put it together, and you're looking at where those pieces sit on the body, you're then going, oh, actually, I don't really like that. So you do just need to, again, take a little bit of time, look at the fabric and decide how you want it to look, again, with that pattern in relation to where it will sit on the body. Now, when it comes to popping on your sleeve for this one, again, we want to make sure we've got our design line, that underarm line, all at the same point, so you get, again, the same part of the faces on the body as what's in the top. And again, that's really key, because you've got your 2 different type of faces and you want to keep it really nice and uniformed and polished. But equally, you know, you might like it to be a little bit more random, and I think that would work really well with this particular fabric. Now, where it comes to the center of your sleeve, I'm going to say that doesn't really matter. I'm going to go with a bit of personal choice, but I have to be honest, as I have gone for the center of my personal choice, if I was cutting this out to actually making it, I would move that center line and I would have my center front line through the center of one of my faces, and I would probably go for this one because I like the tealy nose sticking out. And as that being my center front of whatever I'm making, I would then take that center front line and have that same center front line through my grain line and my center point of my sleeve, again just keeping it really nice and uniformed, and then you've got that nice row of those faces down the outside of your sleeve that mirrors with what's going on through the center front of whatever garment you are making up. Now, I know through the video I have actually used the cinchet dress as my pattern to make it really easy for you to kind of understand how the pattern match actually works. But equally, as long as you would take any one of these particular elements with you to your next project, if you are taking on a patterned fabric, you should find that project slightly less daunting, because if you were making trousers, you would again probably mark in something like your crotch point, because it's going to be on the same part of your front and your back, and you're going to get that same level through there with your pattern all the way through your legs, so your legs would look really uniformed. And then equally, if you were making a skirt, you'd probably have a look at it, your pattern pieces in relation to your ideal length of a skirt, whether it be something like a pencil skirt or a gathered skirt or whatever. You would want to make sure that that hem point of your skirt ends at a really nice point with that pattern. So if you're making this up into a skirt, you probably want at least one of the faces to be the dominant hemline of your skirt. So again, you might stick it with the pink, or you might go with the teal. It's a little bit of personal choice, but it is making sure that you take all those elements and think about how the pattern will sit on your body in your finished garment that you are making up, which will really give you your me-made clothes a really super couture finish, and that really gorgeous polished finish that when people do say to you, oh wow, I love that, and you can stand there with quite a smug look on your face going, yeah, I made it, and watch their jaw drop, you know that you have used every trick in the book that you know to get your garments to look really super polished and really drop dead gorgeous. So we've come to the end of our pattern match video, and I really do hope that I've helped you out to hone your pattern matching skills, and that you now feel more confident in cutting out your fabric to get a really nice pattern match. And also I've given you a few tips on how to stitch together those seams to get that really nice flawless look. So you know, it does make it a little bit easier. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this. If you have any questions about today's pattern match video, do leave a comment and I will get back to you. And equally, if you have a topic that you would like me to tackle, do leave that comment and I will get back to you, and we shall see what we can organise in future for our little catch-ups focusing on different sewing elements. Also, if today's video has really inspired you to practice your pattern matching skills, I would really love to see what you've taken on, whether or not it be one of the gorgeous fabrics that we've had a look at as a part of the video, or maybe you've taken on the cinchet dress to practice your first lot of pattern matching skills. Do use the hashtag pattern matching so we can all find it and see how amazing your pattern matching skills are. It is something that really does inspire a lot of people when they do see something looking amazingly flawless, when they know there is a direct seam there. It leaves a lot of people in absolute awe. Also, if you want to see more Minerva videos, the follow button is just above your video next to where it says Minerva. And don't forget, everything is tagged that I've talked about, so your favourite fabric shouldn't be too hard to find if you haven't already tagged it with the pop-ups as we've gone along. If you've just discovered us here at Minerva, do come and join our community of like-minded makers from across the globe, and do open your Minerva account, as you can save things like this video, or maybe fabrics or patterns, or all sorts of things you can discover here on the Minerva website. And you can also save, I will say, other people's makes, and also different hashtags as well, where you will find a thread of all sorts of creative things under certain hashtags, again, like pattern matching. So I'm Maree here at Minerva. Thanks for stopping by and hanging out with me and having a look at my pattern match video. And I really hope I have taken some of the scariness out of pattern matching fabrics and even picking a bold fabric and, well, picking it up and using it. I really hope I've taken away some of that scariness. So till next time, thanks for watching. And I will see you very soon for another Minerva video. So take care, sew on and stay safe. Bye.